Hello everyone, we will now be resuming where we left off in the previous video, and we're continuing on with the Congress of Vienna, and this is part 2 of part 2. So without further ado, let's get going again.
Metternich was the chair of the German Committee, and now that the crisis over Poland was resolved, he was finally able to get some real work done. Recall that the Congress of Vienna had agreed to use the 1792 borders as a starting point for negotiations. Well, in 1792, the Holy Roman Empire existed. Metternich had no interest in turning back the clock. The Holy Roman Empire had proved itself to be a totally inept institution when faced with a real threat. The German Committee had the task of figuring out what Central Europe would look like in a post-Holy Roman Empire world. As far as Metternich could see, there were 4 possible paths forward. Option number 1, complete independence for everybody. Option number 2, a German empire united under one government. Option number 3, a loose confederation of German states. Option number 4, Austria and Prussia expand and conquer their smaller neighbors. All 4 of these options presented problems. If they decided to go with option number 2, a united German empire, Metternich would obviously insist upon a Habsburg emperor. But given recent experience over Saxony, Metternich did not believe that the Prussians would submit to the Austrians like that. In addition to that, Metternich was getting signals from Castlereagh that the British would not sign off on the creation of a German empire.
Europe at this time is not ready for the creation of a large, centralized state in the middle of Central Europe. And of course, we all know that the matter of the German Empire is only a matter of time at this point, given nationalistic feelings stirred up by Napoleon. But there is a great problem here over whether a Habsburg or a Hohenzollern should sit on this imperial throne if it were created. And that is a question that would not be able to resolve at this time. And it's really only going to be resolved through force, where Prussia, through 2 wars with both Austria and France, managed to forcibly create the German Empire, virtually overnight.
So option number 2 seemed a dead end. Option number 4, Austria and Prussia conquering their neighbors, didn't seem great either. Such aggressive behavior would frighten all the other great powers, and if any of them tried to protect one of the smaller German states, they would all be at war again. That left option number 1 or option number 3, either complete independence or a loose confederation. Of the 2, Metternich's preference was for a loose confederation. He thought that complete independence would leave Central Europe weak and unable to defend itself.
Although Napoleon's wars of conquest had led to a great deal of consolidation in the Holy Roman Empire, the former Holy Roman Empire, it is still the case that Germany is still very much fragmented and susceptible to foreign influence and foreign interventions. And as such, a confederation is probably the best idea at this point in history, and I do think history has proven Metternich's instincts here right, that a confederation was the best option at this point.
It would only be a matter of time until some outside power went to war with one of Austria's weaker neighbors, and then Austria would intervene, and then we're back in a great power conflict situation. A loose confederation, on the other hand, might be enough to deter meddling from outside powers. If there was to be a German confederation, Metternich would first need to mend the relationship with Hardenberg. The Prussian duplicity over Saxony had left a sour taste in everyone's mouth, but if the 2 great powers were to live under the same umbrella, they would have to be friends. Metternich began making his pitch to some of the smaller German states. He found very little resistance. Many felt burned over the Saxony debacle and sought a closer strategic relationship with Austria for their own protection. Metternich's vision for a German Confederation would look like this. All states within the Confederation would maintain their independence, except when it came to matters of military defense. Under the German Confederation, an attack on one would be an attack on all. Any outside power sticking their nose into German affairs would be met with the combined strength of every German state. This ruffled some feathers, because it restricted the ability of German states to make alliances with outside powers.
Yes, and this is sort of a German version of NATO. An attack on one is an attack on all, Article 5 and all that fun. And it's a good deal in terms of a military strategic perspective, because individually each of these German states are quite weak militarily, but put them all together and you suddenly have a really potent military force. And Napoleon had relied heavily on German troops throughout the Napoleonic Wars, and to great success actually. German troops were as reliable as the French themselves, and so this was a good deal. However, the fact that they can no longer make alliances and all that essentially makes it so that these German states sort of lose the right to make their own foreign policy. And that is, I can see how that could be a big sticking point for these German states who for a long time had practical independence, even though they were united under a Habsburg emperor during the Holy Roman Empire. So this will really hamper the ability to make all sorts of deals in terms of foreign policy. But considering the alternatives and the fact that they are all susceptible without being in the Confederation, it's not a bad deal. At least not in my mind.
Bavaria in particular was upset by this, but Metternich soothed things over by pointing out that this would put them in a military alliance with 38 other German states. Such a thing had not been possible under the Holy Roman Empire, and such a thing would not be possible to anybody out there negotiating on their own. Of course, Austria and Prussia were to be exempt from this. They had their own goofy reasoning. They had non-German provinces within their respective empires. Whatever. The real reason is that they were great powers and reserved the right to make alliances or war as they wished.
Yeah, and Bavaria had been a traditional ally of France for a long time at this point, and now not being able to keep or maintain any of those bonds anymore, I could see how that would be annoying. But they are also gaining something, so it's not a complete loss for Bavaria. And the fact that Austria and Prussia retains the right to make war and peace and alliances as they wish, well, that's to be expected. And they are great powers, they dictate the terms here. And if they decide they want to have this right still, then they will have it. Who's going to protest at this point? And like you just said, they had their goofy reasonings, but they were great powers. They did what they wanted. That's the real reason.
Austria and Prussia would be the two anchors of the German Confederation, and it was paramount to the survival of the Confederation that the two great powers within it got along. The German Confederation would have a central diet, a legislature, located in the free city of Frankfurt. The Diet was conceived as a sort of United Nations of Germany, where various independent German states would come together and resolve any disputes that might lead to war. They would also work to reduce barriers so that Germans could live and work and write in any German-speaking country without fear.
Sounds a lot like the European Union's freedom of movement. It's very similar indeed. And maybe they got inspiration from this, who knows? Yeah, just thought I'd point that out.
To this end, they created a weak federal legal system to protect certain political rights across borders. Hardenberg of Prussia was surprisingly supportive of this proposal. The German Diet treated Austria and Prussia as equal partners, which was reassuring to an insecure and young power such as Prussia.
Yeah, so before we go on to Italy, I would like to mention that most of the territorial gains of the Kingdom of Bavaria and the Kingdom of Württemberg and other major German states such as the Grand Duchy of Baden, Hesse-Darmstadt and Nassau, all of those actually managed to retain most of the territorial gains they've gotten during the Napoleonic Wars. And especially Bavaria had been hugely expanded by the grace of Napoleon, who had granted Bavaria much land to beef up Bavaria as a French ally and buffer state. And the fact that they kept most of it was a pretty good deal for them. So yeah, it was surprisingly how well these German states did in the Congress of Vienna. You might expect that Austria might want some territory back, and other German states wanted to be reconstituted. But in the end, this kind of worked for Metternich. He didn't want 300 tiny states. He wanted, 39 medium-sized German states. That was good for his idea of a confederation. Anyways, moving on to Italy.
There were other areas that could not be fully restored under the 1792 borders. Italy had been totally reshaped under French rule, and the Congress of Vienna needed to decide how much French influence was acceptable in the region going forward. At the moment of his defeat, Napoleon had been king of Italy, really northern Italy, and his son had been king of Rome, also northern Italy, and one of his top generals had been the king of Naples, southern Italy. Obviously, this arrangement couldn't continue.
I would argue that the Kingdom of Rome, or whatever you want to call it, was in central Italy, but I digress.
But it was not immediately clear what the Congress should do. Metternich and the Austrian emperor took a particular interest in this. They considered northern Italy Austria's backyard, and Metternich believed that if Austria and France were in constant competition for influence in northern Italy, it would eventually end in another war. Whatever the new political settlement in northern Italy looked like, it had to be able to resist French influence going forward.
And the French and Austria have been competing over primarily northern Italy for quite a long time at this point. You can trace back conflicts between France and Austria at least a century or even more. And the French really loved messing about in Italy. That's something they've done for many centuries, especially interfering with the Pope and all that. We're not gonna do the whole history here, but yeah, suffice it to say, France usually mucks about in Italy, and Austria is doing it a lot now these days too.
Metternich spoke to Castlereagh about this, and the two found that they were of the same mind. Castlereagh told him that Britain was not overly concerned about the future of northern Italy, so long as it remained out of reach for the French. The two men came to an agreement. Remembering the Poland-Saxony crisis, Castlereagh said that the British public was in an anti-imperialist mood right now, and so he couldn't appear to support any sweeping annexations of territory. However, Britain had no problem with Austrian hegemony in the region. If Metternich could draw up a plan that only made minor territorial adjustments, wink wink, he could count on Castlereagh's support. Once it became clear to all parties that the future of Italy was being discussed, there were calls to replicate the success of the German committee by forming an Italian committee. Metternich and Castlereagh shut this talk down immediately. Per their agreement, the future of Italy would be decided by Metternich alone.
Well, with hindsight, an Italian committee might have been a good idea.
This is what he came up with. Austria would conduct a minor territorial adjustment by directly annexing Lombardy and Venice. This would add millions of Italians to the Austrian Empire. Metternich knew that the Hungarians would have opposed any deal that added more ethnic Germans to the empire, since it would have upset the delicate balance within Austria. Expanding into northern Italy was seen as politically neutral, so Metternich used this opportunity to beef up Austria by annexing one of the richest parts of Europe.
Yeah, northern Italy has been a very rich area, even dating back, almost to the Roman times. Not quite that far, but for a long time, Lombardy had been a very rich province indeed. It is still one of the richest regions in Europe. And, well, this is a minor territorial adjustment. It's not really that minor when you stop and think about it, really. It includes what was formerly the Republic of Venice and the Duchy of Milan. So, I don't know about that, but, you can justify it however you want.
Castlereagh noticed this, but deemed it minor enough to escape the notice of the British public. Next, Metternich recreated the Duchy of Parma and handed it over to Mary Louise of Austria, the Austrian Emperor's eldest daughter. The fact that she remained the wife of Napoleon was a bit inconvenient, so Metternich carved out a rule so that the duchy would go to some nephew of the Spanish king upon her death.
The Spanish were really miffed about this. They really wanted the cadet branch of the Bourbons to be restored to these Italian duchies. This was Metternich's way of, well, okay, but, not right now.
Spain had been upset when Metternich got the authority to reshape northern Italy, and this was Metternich's way of throwing them a bone.
It should be said that throughout this entire process, Spain has been very angry with Austria in particular, but all of the entire concept of the Congress, because they do not feel it is justified to shut them out of the, informal negotiations between the great powers. They consider themselves to be an equal of the other great powers. They were not, in fact, an equal at this point in history, but you could see how, considering the role they played and the sufferings they were inflicted by the French, you could see how they wanted to be in on this, but alas, it was not to be.
The Grand Duchy of Tuscany was also recreated and handed over to the brother of the Austrian Emperor. Similarly, the Duchy of Modena was recreated and handed to some cousin of the Austrian Emperor. Noticing a pattern yet? By doing this, Metternich technically met Castlereagh's requirement to not openly annex all of northern Italy.
Yeah, this is a classic move that has been seen many times throughout history, and the use of client states, the creation of client states, whereby they formally have independence and on paper they're a fully autonomous state, but in reality they are subordinate to whatever great power who is behind the creation of this client state. And that is the case here in Italy again. This is what the French did during the Revolutionary Wars. They created all of these sister republics. Also what Napoleon did when he put all of his brothers and sisters on various thrones in Europe. He created client states who advance the interest of the French Empire. So, yeah, this is a bit of a cheeky move by Metternich, but it works.
But it was a bit deceptive. In some cases, the prime ministers of these new states would be Austrian officials hand-picked by Metternich. On paper, these were all independent countries, but in reality, the Austrians were treating northern Italy like a colony. In
Not for
addition
the
to
first
all
time.
this, Metternich reformed the Papal States, which was an important sticking point to the majority Catholic Austrian Empire.
Yes, the Pope has been kept in house arrest in France for about 7 years or something like that. He was there for a long time at least. And Napoleon had disbanded the Papal States and annexed it into the French Empire. But the Papal States is still an important state institution. And this is, if you don't know, the Pope's personal domains. In history, the Pope has always been, or not always, but for a long time, the Pope was a secular as well as a spiritual leader. Nowadays, he's just a spiritual leader. Technically, he rules over an independent country, Vatican City, but Vatican City is not big, and the Papal States was a fair bit larger than that, as you can see on the map. But this is about the size the Papal States always had throughout its long history. And yeah, returning this to the Pope was important for many Catholics, and it would be important later on when Italian revolutionaries roll in and start romping about, and then Napoleon III is forced to intervene, and it's a story for another time.
He also strengthened and restored the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia.
That would prove to be a big mistake for Austria, because it's the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, which will lead the Italian nationalist revolution, basically. And it is thanks to the efforts of Piedmont, Sardinia that the Kingdom of Italy can be established in 7 decades or so. So yeah, that would turn out to be a big mistake, but at the time it made sense. It would create another buffer state to hinder French expansion into Italy.
As an independent and fairly strong regional power, they would serve as a buffer against any future French expansion. Finally,
probably the strongest Italian kingdom, maybe second to the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, aka Naples.
Napoleon's former general was eventually removed from southern Italy, and a distant relation of the King of Spain returned to rule the region once more.
Another member of the House of Bourbon, Marshal Murat, King of Naples by the grace of Napoleon, by the way, is going to be deposed when he joins Napoleon during the 100 Days campaign.
I should briefly talk about how Napoleon's general was removed from southern Italy. It involves an event known to history as the 100 Days. Here's a brief summary of what happened. When the Congress of Vienna was like 6 months into negotiations, Napoleon secretly slipped away from his confinement on the island of Elba and landed in southern France. He marched north with maybe 1,000 supporters, but as he advanced, thousands more flocked to his banner. 3 weeks after landing in France, he captured Paris without firing a shot. The Allies had long feared something like this, and in fact, during the last 6 months of negotiations, the great powers had kept their armies mobilized for this very reason. Within hours of Napoleon's disappearance from Elba, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were marching on France. 3 months after Napoleon captured Paris, British and Prussian armies faced the French outside the town of Waterloo in the Netherlands, current-day Belgium. At Waterloo, Napoleon was soundly defeated by the British general Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. Napoleon fled, and about a month later, he surrendered to the British, who promptly sent him to the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where, under the watchful eye of the British, he would spend the rest of his days. I've been strategically talking around the 100 days for this entire video, because while it's certainly militarily interesting, and Napoleonically interesting, it's not diplomatically interesting.
It's true.
From the perspective of the Congress of Vienna, the 100 days were a brief pause in negotiations, after which everyone just picked back up where they left off. Also, and this may annoy some people, but it must be said, the 100 days were not a particularly close call. When Napoleon captured Paris, he had maybe 50,000 soldiers at his disposal. The Allies had 1 million. Naturally, Napoleon immediately began raising 100,000 additional soldiers, but so did the Allies, and by this point, the Allies were faster. If Napoleon had won at Waterloo, there would have been another Waterloo later that summer. If he had won 10 Waterloos, the Allies still would have had him outnumbered. The entire 100 days was an act of delusion, and there was never a serious threat of a French victory.
I can see how that sort of definitive statement might annoy some people, but I'm sort of forced to agree here. I think even Napoleon realized that this was a long shot, and maybe there is some scenario in which he could possibly negotiate a peace, but there are not many of those. And I would say probably 9 times out of 10, it would just end with Napoleon being forced to abdicate again in one way or another.
Anyways, I bring all that up because Napoleon's former general, the King of Naples, sided with Napoleon during the crisis, which gave...
Even though Napoleon didn't want to hear anything about Murat ever again, he never wanted to speak to him again, and yeah. It was typical of Murat to be so opportunistic. It was his opportunism that led him to cut the secret deal with the Allies to let him keep his throne in the first place. And now he's just throwing it away in order to side with Napoleon. I really don't know what he was thinking, but then again, Murat is not famous for thinking at all.
Metternich a good excuse to remove him from power and have him executed.
Oh boy, not this one. This is a controversial one.
So here was the framework for the final settlement. Broadly speaking, Europe would return to its 1792 borders. Russia would swallow up Poland under a strict constitutional arrangement, and Prussia would annex half of Saxony. The Holy Roman Empire would be replaced with the much more practical German Confederation. Northern Italy would become an anti-French zone under Austrian supervision.
I should also mention one other major territorial change that happened, and that was that the Treaty of Kiel was ratified by the Congress of Vienna, and that meant that Sweden was allowed to absorb Norway, taken from formerly Denmark, Norway, and a personal union between the two countries was created, creating the new kingdom of Sweden, Norway, which would last until its dissolution, peaceful dissolution in 1905. And that is one of the other major territorial changes. Also, there were some colonies that were played. Anyway, some colonies were shifted hands, but all in all, the status quo was retained there. Let's see. The independence of Switzerland was guaranteed. Switzerland was reconstituted. Well, that might be a wrong word, but Switzerland was guaranteed neutrality. And well, then we have What else? What else? Yeah, I think that's it. Oh, well, the Netherlands was reformed, combining the former provinces of the United Provinces and the Austrian Netherlands to create a strong and beefed up Netherlands to serve as a buffer for future French expansion along that direction. Yeah, but other than that, I think he mentioned the most important bits of the Congress of Vienna. And now we're getting into the final part of the agreement, and that is concerning the slave trade. And this is perhaps, without a doubt, the most disappointing part of the Treaty of Vienna.
With negotiations drawing to a close, there was one lingering issue that had not yet been addressed. The British Prime Minister Liverpool instructed Castlereagh to begin discussing slavery. By 1815, the British anti-slavery political movement had truly become a force to be reckoned with. In 1788, a bunch of local abolitionist groups sent Parliament 60,000 signatures calling for the abolition of slavery. In 1815, these same groups gathered almost 1 million signatures, but this time they didn't send them to Parliament. They sent them to Castlereagh in Vienna. One statistic that was not lost on anybody was that the number of signatures sent to Castlereagh was greater than the total number of votes in the last election. This was not simply an act of protest, it was a shot across the bow. By this time, every British city and most British towns had an abolitionist group that was active in local politics. It was not uncommon for the average British voter to hear about the ongoing sin of slavery on a weekly basis in their church and in their newspaper. The issue became impossible to avoid. After one particularly incendiary pamphlet went viral, more than 300,000 women pledged to boycott sugar since it was exclusively produced with slave labor. People were hungry for action, and when the government showed no interest in doing anything, they grabbed at whatever consumer choices might make a difference.
Yeah, the abolitionist movement, especially in Britain, was really quite something. It's one of the first real modern popular movements, and we would see something similar. We would see more of it during the 20th century, not in the case of abolition, of course. That issue would have been dealt with by then, but I'm talking about the labor movement, for example. I'm talking about, in the US, we have the banning of alcohol and the whole discussion about that. And we see all of these popular movements starts to, get rolling around this time. And this would only continue on. Of course, I've already mentioned it several times. 1848 is perhaps the greatest example of it, where people called for liberty, democracy, equality, all of that fun stuff. And the abolition movement in Britain at this time was really a force to be reckoned with. And it was really forcing all of these politicians and policymakers to, for once, factor into the consideration the views of the people at large, which is something they're going to have to get more and more used to as time goes on.
Political activism against slavery was so popular in some circles that it became fashionable, literally. This medallion, called the Wedgwood Medallion, was mass-produced in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Men generally wore them around their necks, and women around their wrists or pinned into their hair. The inscription reads, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This image of a man kneeling in chains became the most widely distributed piece of art depicting a black man ever, and the unofficial logo of the anti-slavery movement. In 1807, at the end of a political fight that lasted more than 15 years, Britain passed an act that abolished the British slave trade. It did not abolish the act of slavery, but it made it illegal to transport enslaved persons across the Atlantic to the colonies. Advocates believed that without new bodies coming over from Africa, chattel slavery in the colonies would mostly die out within 1 or 2 generations. They were wrong, but it was nevertheless a big deal that Britain finally acknowledged that their goal was to eventually abolish slavery. The abolitionists were, correctly, not satisfied by this half measure. They demanded nothing less than the complete and total abolition of slavery.
I think in Britain the abolition finally happens around 1830. I might be mistaken there, but somebody in the comments surely will correct me otherwise. But yeah, it's going to take a lot longer for the other European powers to get to that point though, and that is quite unfortunate. And the legacy of slavery is, I wouldn't say it's a super hotly debated topic here in Europe these days, but I know it's still a topic of discussion in the US politics. So, you know, we're still grappling with the legacy of European slavery, and it is a real shameful track record that we have. But unfortunately, although we don't talk about it much more anymore, slavery is still a thing, although we call it trafficking, human trafficking. We call it by other names, but slavery is unfortunately very much a thing in other parts of the world these days. So, but I digress. It was just a side tangent, not really something to do with this specifically.
And as the years went on, their influence only continued to grow. Lord Liverpool inherited this political situation when he became Prime Minister, and he wasn't happy about it. He was holding on to his conservative Whig majority in Parliament by the barest of threads, and now the abolitionists had sent 1 million signatures to his Foreign Secretary in Vienna. Liverpool didn't really care one way or the other about slavery, but if he didn't give these people something, they might topple his government. He instructed Castlereagh to try to get some anti-slavery commitments into the final agreement at Vienna. Castlereagh approached the 8-member Central Committee, that is, the 5 great powers plus Spain, Portugal, and Sweden, and asked them to include a provision in the final agreement that committed everybody to the eventual abolition of the slave trade. Of those present, only Britain and Sweden had abolished the slave trade. Castlereagh's opening position was that everybody else should adopt Britain's anti-slavery laws. Another way of saying that is that Castlereagh was not committing Britain to any further anti-slavery reforms. This fact was not lost on Castlereagh's negotiating partners. Spain, Portugal, and France threw a fit. France is an interesting case.
Yeah, and what does all those 3 have in common? They all have colonial possessions. Russia and Austria don't really at this point, and they never will have any real colonies. So yeah, this is whom it does concern the most, and they are going to be quite incensed about it, especially Portugal and Spain, who have been the traditional colonial superpowers, no longer though.
Because they had heroically abolished slavery at the beginning of their revolution, and then under Napoleon, they shamefully brought it back. Spain and Portugal were the other 2 powers most heavily enmeshed with the slave trade. Spain, Portugal, and France argued that Britain only wanted to abolish the slave trade because they had a head start out in the colonies. They also argued that an agreement like this would give the British Navy an excuse to stop and inspect every ship in the Atlantic. In other words, this would all be to Britain's advantage. Castlereagh tried to respond by appealing to morality, but this only incensed them even further. One Spanish diplomat got in Castlereagh's face and told him The English have always been good at making business march alongside honor.
He's got a point.
Castlereagh was Irish.
I'm Irish.
Ah, yes. Castlereagh was really an Irish Biden.
If we think about this for a moment, Castlereagh could have shown Britain's commitment to the cause by talking about complete and total abolition, which would have hurt Britain more than anyone.
True.
If he had walked into the room talking about abolition, he would have had some credibility, because he would have been saying, let's all do something difficult together. But Castlereagh didn't bring up total abolition, because he was an imperialist, and he wasn't that personally bothered by slavery. After some agonizing negotiations, they agreed to attach a document to the final treaty coming out of Vienna, called a Declaration of Intent to Abolish the Slave Trade. At Spain and Portugal's insistence, this declaration would be non-binding, which sucks.
Yeah. Considering every other part of the treaty is binding, yeah, this is pretty bad. And you can still see it today when you have non-binding UN resolutions, non-binding treaties. It's just a piece of paper with some nice words on it if it's non-binding. If it isn't binding, then there is really no point. And yeah.
Castlereagh was like, if it's non-binding, we're going to need to show people some specific goals at least. France agreed to abolish the slave trade within 5 years. They would blow right past that deadline. Spain agreed to abolish the slave trade within 8 years, with some pretty large loopholes. They would blow right past that deadline. Portugal would only agree to abolish the slave trade north of the equator. And since they didn't really have any colonies north of the equator, this was pretty much a giant middle finger to the rest of the Congress. Castlereagh also got all of the participants to declare their intention to eradicate slavery once and for all, but they provided absolutely no specifics and no deadlines. A meaningless statement meant to simply soothe public opinion.
Yep.
In the end, Britain's attempt to inject anti-slavery commitments into the Congress was a failure. The reason it was a failure is that Castlereagh didn't even really try. He was half-hearted from the start, and his reluctance to come in there with any radical proposals was a signal to the other great powers that Britain wasn't really taking this seriously. It's a shame, because this was a moment when something big could have been accomplished. Britain had serious leverage and serious public support, and Castlereagh didn't use any of it. One of the consequences of Castlereagh's lack of enthusiasm in 1815 was that slavery continued in places like Cuba and Brazil until the late 1880s. That's a lot of lives and a lot of years, and it's a real stain on Castlereagh's record that he didn't really try to do anything about it. But from a purely political standpoint, the anti-slavery negotiations worked. Prime Minister Liverpool now had something to show the discontents back home.
Yeah. And that's really the point of what this whole document is, to ensure Liverpool's continual political survival back in Britain. And when you have a chief negotiator who's an imperialist, who isn't really all that hot on, abolishing the slave trade and slavery, well, you can figure out the results for yourself. If they were really serious about this, they should have changed to a negotiator who actually believed in those causes and who could advocate passionately on behalf of those issues. But they didn't. And as such, we got a meaningless document attached to the final treaty.
And for now, that was enough. The Treaty of Vienna was finalized in June of 1815. All of the great powers signed off on it. The only outlier was Spain, who remained upset over Metternich's heavy-handed treatment of northern Italy.
They were also upset of being, excluded. But Spain would ratify the treaty in 1817 instead. They eventually accepted the outcome, and that they could do nothing to change anything in it. So, good on them for, eventually coming around to reality.
Spain refused to sign the final document, which was unfortunate. But so long as all the great powers were on board, this was deemed acceptable. The final treaty was mostly built upon realist principles and created a balance of power with clearly defined spheres of influence that would, hopefully, prevent future great power conflicts. After Vienna, it was widely understood and accepted that if anybody invaded one of those tiny German states, it would automatically mean war with Prussia and Austria. If anybody invaded northern Italy, it would automatically mean war with Austria. If anybody invaded the Netherlands, it would automatically mean war with Britain. If anybody invaded Poland, it would automatically mean war with Russia. The belief was that so long as governments understood what was and wasn't off limits, minor disagreements could be solved diplomatically, and great power conflicts on the scale of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars could be entirely avoided. It was in the interest of all great powers to respect these limitations, and if any great power was found to be acting recklessly or belligerently, it was in the interest of everybody else to put them in their place. After 25 years of chaos and war, the great powers were having a go at stability. This international system that emerged from Vienna is sometimes called the Concert of Europe, as in all of Europe acting in concert or in unison. The next 15 years would put a severe test upon the concert system, and we will see in time whether these frenzied and far-reaching negotiations were worth it.
Yeah, that's a pretty good conclusion of what the Congress of Vienna actually managed to accomplish. And I would just end on this saying that in the 19th century and even more recent historians and politicians, they really criticized this treaty for ignoring nationalism and liberalism and for imposing this stifling reaction on the continent of Europe. And they saw it as a way for the conservative traditional order to maintain their grip on power and, try to put the genie back in the bottle when it comes to the French Revolution. Also by suppressing, democratic and civil rights sentiments. And in a way, they are correct because although they may have put a lid on this issue for a while, the fact is tensions in Europe is going to explode in 1848, and it will explode again and again after that, with nationalist revolts and liberal revolutions becoming more commonplace. But on the other hand, I also agree with the 20th century historians and politicians who looked back on the Congress of Vienna, because they did see it prevent another widespread European conflict until the First World War. And it was a significant step in creating a new international order in which peace could largely be maintained through diplomatic dialogue. And it served as a role model for later international forums such as the United Nations and other important international institutions. And as such, I think in the end, we can all see that the Congress of Vienna did not lead to a perfect solution. And in some ways, it just pushed some issues to the side or kicked the can down the road. But looking at it at even longer term, it did undoubtedly save many lives in Europe that would have been spent needlessly on petty wars and great power conflicts. And as such, we must recognize that it did indeed have major value. So with those words, I will leave you all to your thoughts. And if you have any of those that you would like to relay to me, then you might use the comment function down below. And yeah, anyways, this video has gone on for a very long time, so I better end it here. But we'll be back with some other Historia Civilis content in the future, no doubt. And until then, I'll see you guys later. Bye.